to every week is, I scan through several hundred stories. I've gotten better at that, so I can take care of it now in about 2 or 3 hours a week just to scan the stories. Then I get what I think are the best stories and do a short write up and understand them well enough to make my clever remark about them. And then I cut it down. And so that's going to be 40 or 50 stories now. And then I cut that down to just a few stories. And that's what we talk about here. And it's for a long time, the question is always from that, what's the good stuff this week? And this week, there's some areas where I couldn't decide what the good stuff was, and I was running late, so I have a longer list. And the top story, I personally love the top story. It's about a 17-year-old kid who has designed a new version of a kind of electric engine that could replace all of these magnet driven electric motors in all the EVs using up all the precious rare earths on the planet with a motor that doesn't use any of that stuff, and it's made from inexpensive stuff. And this is a 17-year-old kid, a senior in high school. So I think, to me, it's one of these amazing stories, actually. The next one is a more up-to-date story on the risk of brain fog, that famous long COVID symptom that scares a lot of people more than anything else about it except dying. So I have an update on brain fog. Then my technology stories is about EVs, and it's really about Dodge is abandoning their production of the muscle cars for which they're so famous. And next year will be the last year of production of the Dodge gas-powered chargers and things like this. It turns out, of course, the year after that, they're going to introduce their new line of electric muscle cars. Then in space and physics, I put them together in the same category because they're really just different ways of looking at the same stuff, I think. And this is a physics story instead of a space story. And it may be the most exciting physics story of, I don't know, the century. And that is they finally figured out, those guys at Livermore Labs figured out that a year ago, they reached ignition in their fusion stuff. And the thing about that is ignition is the place where it powers itself. And once you have ignition, there's leftover power to do things like electrify the planet and stuff like that. So it's cool.
Little things like that.
It's actually an amazing thing. One of the things about that particular story is, this news is released in a paper, and there have been a lot of scientists working on this. And this particular paper is released with over 1,000 credited authors. I would hate to be on that proofreading team. The next story, I have several environmental stories because I thought they all deserved it, and I'll try to cover them quickly. The first is, cement is the thing we make the most of on the planet, and 7% of the CO2 and pollutants in the atmosphere come from making cement. And it turns out we now know how to stop all of that. And we grow our limestone using algae. So instead of polluting the air, the algae actually eats up a little CO2, and you don't have to use all that energy to heat it up to release what you need to make cement. So that's a 7% slice of our pollution that is fixed with using algae. And the thing about algae is if you look at net efficiencies, the closer you are to what consumes and produces the basic material, the more efficient you are. The thing that eats algae can never be as efficient as algae, just like bacteria. Whatever eats bacteria is never going to be as efficient as bacteria. So using those as your productive materials in the end gives you the highest efficiency that you can get. And speaking of bacteria, they have bacteria now that if you have the right combination, it turns out it can eat the plastics that are in the lakes. So I would like that. And then we remember the Green Revolution, don't you? I guess 40 years ago, it's the different selected plant that the guy figured out over 20 years and found dwarf wheat varieties that doubles yields and needed all this nitrogen fertilizer, but it fed the world, which is useful if you like people. And it turns out now the biological revolution, the green revolution, is coming to farming. And my story is about two different biological developments, either of which massively decrease the amount of nitrogen that you need in the plant. And one big source of environmental pollution is the runoff of these nitrogen fertilizers. And if you don't need the nitrogen fertilizers, not only is it cheaper for the farmer, but the farmers don't have this runoff of chemicals that cause other problems. So that's a green revolution that is even more revolutionary than the last one. So that's coming. And then I have a couple of human stories. The first is some high-end philosopher kind of guys, and he is talking about something that he calls long-termism, which is, we're used to some people think big, and he's thinking about maybe what we could do now to help humans thrive trillions of years in the future. So optimizing over the long term turns out sometimes to be a good deal. And I haven't met anybody that I ever read talking about humans, talking about what can we do for trillions of years, or even half billions of years. In a half billion years, the sun is going to give us problems. You can fix it, can't you, Daryl? Well, he says if you start working on it now, who knows? Then we won't have to go to other planets. Then in the human brains, there is actual evidence that smartphones can improve memory skills. And I'll talk to you about it. I think that's interesting, going from Neanderthals to humans. Our brains are smaller than Neanderthals. I believe the reason why is we've upgraded our culture, and now we keep more information in our group culture, so we don't have to keep as much in our puny little head. Something happened that makes our brains smaller, and it didn't seem like we are less successful than Neanderthals since we're here and they're not. Then the last couple of stories are just things we need to do to take care of it ourselves. It turns out leisure activities and things like that, things like we are doing right now, are established to reduce the chance of dementia. So what you're doing right now is taking care of your most precious resource for the rest of your life. So that's a good way to use your time, right?
Absolutely.
And then the last story is a story that I'm happy to see. And it's a story about one of my least favorite subjects, which is exercise. And it turns out, at least for strength, the best way to exercise is a little frequently instead of a lot periodically. So, those strenuous sessions at the gym, give them up and just do a little bit at home every day, and you'll get the same results, and you won't have to drive to the gym. I guess you miss a social opportunity then. So it's all complicated. We got different things going on at once. So let me proceed with more details. And again, the first story, I just am anxious to show you this kid. So here is this 17-year-old kid. His name is Robert Sansome, and he's a high school senior in Florida. And this is a test bench that he is using, testing his newly updated electric motor. And the thing about Robert is he's been interested. He's one of these kids who's just a natural born engineer. And he thinks he's already completed at least 60 engineering projects already, things like animatronic hands and high-speed running boots and a go-kart that can do 70 miles an hour. And so he's done all of this stuff in his spare time, probably in his garage. And a couple of years ago, he came across a video about the advantages and disadvantages of electric cars. And the video explained that most electric car motors use magnets, and the magnets are made from rare earth elements, which are costly and environmentally damaging. Some of them cost hundreds of dollars per kilogram. Copper costs about $8 a kilogram. And he's a guy, he says, I have a natural interest in electric motors. And with that sustainability issue, I wanted to try to design a different motor. And he had heard about a different kind of electric motor, the synchronous reluctance motor, that doesn't use magnets or rare earth magnets. And it's currently used for pumps and fans, but just isn't powerful enough to consider for more applications. Also, what they have, I don't understand this part of it, is a fixed speed motor. So I don't know how you use that to drive a variable speed device like a car. You have to have a transmission or something. But anyway, so he started brainstorming, and over a year, he created a prototype. He doesn't have much of a prototyping facility, so he made his prototype from 3D printed plastic copper wires and a steel rotor. And recently, his work earned him first prize and $75,000 in the largest high school STEM competition in the world, the Regen International Science and Engineering phase. And he the number of applications that are using motors and magnets is getting larger and larger. And there's a problem with material sources where much of it is from China. So he's dealing with things that are real issues. Electric motors use rotating electromagnets to create the spin. That's what happens in a car now. Synchronous reluctance motors don't use magnets. Instead, they have a steel rotor with air gaps cut into it that aligns itself with the rotating magnet field. So the engine is rotating and the magnet field is rotating, and this rotor is rotating all synchronously. That's why they call it synchronous reluctance. Reluctance refers to how magnetic the material is. So they're using these basic magnetic effects for power. And so as the rotor spin, it produces torque. The torque spins the wheel of the car. And it turns out there within this rotor, there's a thing called a saliency ratio, which is a difference in the magnetism between materials. Usually the reluctance motors they have now are made with fixed materials with fixed gaps. So they run at constant speed and constant torque because the reluctance doesn't change. And he figured out a trick, putting another magnetic field in between them so he can change the magnetic properties and change the amount of torque the engine produced and increased it. And so his models already made with his high-tech 3D printer are able to produce about 30% more torque than any of the previous generations. And he's still working on it. He doesn't have it patented yet because he's still working out the details. And you know, uh, he's doing as best he can. He didn't have a ton of resources, and uh, a person reviewing his work says there's the potential that this could be the next big thing. And many professors work on research their whole lives, and it's fairly rare that they end up changing and taking over the world. And here is this new kid using new ideas and also new manufacturing technologies that he can change the electric motor industry forever and get rid of a lot of these rare earth magnets. So I think that's a pretty good job. I wonder what he'll do when he gets out of high school.
Right. I remember when I was 17, I was like listening to albums and doing some of my homework, but that was about it.
I might have been listening to albums. The only homework I did in high school was my math homework, and usually I did that in social studies.
Right.
And I never did any of the outside assigned work in all the 3 years. And in high school, you were graded at that time on class participation. I'm a big mouth, so that worked well. And test scores. And I started reading a lot when I was 10, so it didn't matter what I was tested and I knew something about it anyway. And then the other part was homework. And so it turns out you get an A on the test and an A on class participation and a D or an F in homework. And it worked out to a B. So I had a B average.
Right.
And, anyway, my mother was happy. One of the things that might have influenced my behavior is I don't recall ever in my childhood being asked by my mother, "Did you do your homework tonight, honey?" And so I didn't. I learned in business, there's somebody's rule, you get what you inspect.
Right.
That's the
So
quality inspector rule.
I'm guessing this kid, he must have read up. I'm wondering what made him go into this field. What made him go into this? I don't know.
It sounds like a part of it is he liked to tinker.
Yeah.
You
But
know,
I used to tinker on slot cars, if you remember slot cars.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and that was my tinkering, I guess. But yeah, but not
Anyway,
on electromagnetic motors.
yes, it's a different day. One of the things I hear like this of kids in Africa who are the first generation to get access to a little bit of education, who figure out how to do stuff using junk around to make pumps to irrigate their parents' field with water. And they do it because they got a little bit of education and they found some book with some idea about it and figured out how to use it.
Right.
Okay, the next is for us COVID survivors like me. And I guess they say pretty 2/3 of the world has had COVID already. So I think it's a lot of others. And that is in the beginning, there were studies worrying about long-term consequences of mental consequences from COVID.
Hey, Richard,
Yes.
your microphone is down a little bit. It's muffled.
Okay.
It's down in your shirt.
Okay. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. If I did a good job, I would look for my microphone every time. Thank you. We get by with a little help from our friends.
Right.
Anyway, a year ago, researchers from Oxford reported 1 in 3 patients that experienced mood disorders, strokes, or dementia 6 months after infection. 1 out of 3. So that's pretty frightening. They followed up and did a long-term analysis with more than 1 million patients. And the news is maybe good and bad. Up to 2 years after COVID infections, the risk for developing mental conditions such as dementia, brain fog, and seizures is still higher than any other respiratory illness. So that's kind of significant. Anxiety and depression, though, go away after a couple of months. So that's not an issue. It turns out variants have higher rates of brain fog. Delta has 38% more brain fog. Omicron's about the same. Again, mood disorders and anxiety stuff goes away. So what they see is these neurocognitive deficits do not resolve so quickly. And again, they're finding them 2 years after the onset of COVID. The one thing now they talk about risk, they do have within the article some statistics that make it less frightening. And so if you look at COVID patients versus non-COVID patients, COVID patients have higher risk, but it works out to be like 150 per 10,000. So it's still 1.5%. So the risk is greater, but it's still a little number. And I'm grateful that it's a little number instead of 1 in 3. 1.5 in 100 is a lot uh, less scary. Now, the problem still with this number, though, is dementia has what they call an insidious onset. And it's likely that the number are underreported because they are not able to observe the dementia yet. So we don't know what the numbers are, but certainly it's not 1 in 3. And even if it's twice as bad as the numbers we have here, that's 3 out of 100 rather than 1 in 3. So I think that's less bad. What do you guys think?
Well,
I agree.
go ahead.
But no, I mean, I was hearing seizures. That's what happened to me early last week.
Uh-huh.
Wound up in the hospital. And it's a funny thing. I don't remember any of it, but when I came out of it, I mean, I was all wired up and
Uh-huh. Well, I hope it wasn't brain fog. I found out something last week. My wife found a strip of hair that was turning white and falling out, and we went to the dermatologist, and she asked me immediately, "Did you have COVID?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "I have alopecia. That's the stuff that makes you go bald. It's only in a small area there, and they're trying to fight it back."
Was that because of COVID?
Well, she said that's what she asked, and she said she's seeing people like that. I haven't seen that as a reported symptom, but she's in the biz.
Yeah, I haven't heard that yet.
Uh-huh.
That's a new
no,
one.
So
no,
that
no.
qualifies as episodic evidence.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No,
that,
it's still bald, that spot.
oh, it's there. I will be treated for it for about a month and a half. She gave me some shots. She gave me 2 different kind of pills. She gave me 1 kind of cream and then some stinky shampoo. And I've used all of those, and my wife still looks at the back of my head and gasps. I don't think that means that's not good.
Well,
So,
yeah, as males, we can go bald, and it apparently is accepted.
uh-huh. Now, the other one, I'm afraid for me, there is some bad news in this medical report. And that is my wife saw it 2 weeks before this, and she didn't say anything. She thought she would just let it ride because she knows sometimes I'm not cooperative when she reports a new problem. So she was just letting it ride. And then it turns out it got worse, and she should have reacted right away and got on my case at the very beginning. And I'm not sure I want to train my wife to do that.
I
Anyway,
think the training days are probably over.
well, she's sure that that's true for me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I suspect she's right. Okay, the next story is about Dodge, and Dodge next year is ending production of their Charger and Challenger, their muscle cars that they've made versions of since the 1960s and 70s. And they've been in a lot of movies and stuff like that about hot rods. And they're doing this as a part of the movements from the major automakers moving away from traditional gas engines. And as as I said in the introduction, it's not all bad. The year after they get rid of the gas muscle cars, they're going to introduce their really powerful electric muscle cars. There's a problem though with the muscle cars now because one part is acceleration already when you have the Teslas going from 0 to 60 in what, 5 seconds or something. You're not going to have a lot more acceleration. You have trouble making the rubber connect to the road to go any faster. But, with the muscle cars, these are these big lumbering cars that make all the noise. EVs are quiet. So what they have added to the Dodge muscle cars is a sound system that'll produce about 130 decibels, enough to make you go deaf of motor noise. So you can still be the toughest guy with the biggest swinging parts around. And so they, of course, their marketing department says, quote, "We are celebrating the end of an era and the start of a bright new electrified future." You like that, John?
No, not particularly. I like quiet.
But is it good copy? I didn't mean did you like the idea. I just mean as a marketing guy, did you
Oh,
like
well,
the writing?
yeah, it's logic.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I wonder if the National Hot Rod Association will create a division for electric dragsters.
Right. I'm sure there must already be one.
I don't know. I'm curious. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right. I agree with your curiosity. It would be inevitable. And, as I say, at that level, already the problem is how do you get that much power on the road to turn it into acceleration? And that's going to be even more the case if you have more torque, because what are you going to do? Put 1,000-pound weight on your car to...
Right. I don't know. I don't think they'll ever get to that torque level, but who knows? Who knows? Hey,
Right.
maybe that 17-year-old kid can figure it out.
That's right. That's right. Next, I want him to take care of the, electric motors that we're making in 5 years first.
Yeah.
Okay. The part of the story is what diet will actually work to be best for the planet. This is an environmental story. And there are a bunch of different diets now. And the food we consume has a massive impact on our planet. Agriculture takes up half of the habitable land, and that's kind of a problem. So we use half of our land space to grow our food. It destroys forests and ecosystems, produces a quarter of our greenhouse gases, and out of that 25%, about 15% or 60% of the environmental pollution from agriculture comes from meat and dairy products. So that points at a particular place. So the question in this is, how do you eat for your own health and for the health of the planet? And I would say that's a non-trivial question. And there are a bunch of different climate-friendly diets to choose from now. The best known is the completely plant-based vegan diet. Then there are vegetarian diets that let you have eggs and dairy, and pescatarian diets, which means you can kill fish. It's okay to kill fish because when they cry, you can't hear them, I guess. Then there are new forms like a flexitarian diet in which 3/4 of the meat and dairy is replaced by plant-based protein. That actually is close to how Carol and I have started eating this year. Then there's the Mediterranean diet, which we've all heard of, which lets you have moderate amounts of poultry, pork, lamb, and bad beef. And then there are even newer forms. Now, one of the things I've been reading about is a climatarian diet, where you optimize your diet for what's good for the climate. And that diet still allows the use of meat and other stuff, but you have to balance it out against the other environmental impacts. And these the standard Western meat-based diet produces about 7.2 kilograms of CO2 a day. So that's about 15 pounds of CO2 that the usual Western diet produces. A vegetarian diet produces about half, a little more than half of that, 3.8. And a vegan diet, less than half, 2.9. And if you look at this here, I have a handy dandy graph that we'll look at. And this is how much CO2 you save with your diet. And the Mediterranean diet saves about half of the CO2, and you can see the vegan saves the most. A vegetarian is close. This guy is proposing an ultra flexitarian, which is still let you have a little bit of meat, no red meat, no processed meat, but it gives you flexibility. So, you can go out and maybe find something to eat. And then other diets, the pescatarian is better than the Mediterranean, but it still contributes a lot. So I'm pleased that they're starting to make good analysis of these different forms of diet. So I think it can be a little bit of a guideline for us to figure out how to eat. Carol and I have gone to a mostly plant-based diet with plant-based protein. We can't go all the way because I have kidney issues, and if I have too much plant-based protein, it gives me kidney problems. So I can't go all the way, but I can go part of the way. And as I went through my recent health checks and stuff like this, making this change for me has actually seems like it's continuing to keep my diabetes under good control. It's got my blood pressure under control, and my kidney doctor smiles when he sees me, not because he's going to make more money from me.
So
But
do you consider yourself a flexitarian then?
I had never heard the term until I
haven't
read
either.
this article. But now I would.
Yeah, yeah. That's the first time I've heard of that word.
Uh-huh. And probably I still have too much bad stuff to be a good flexitarian.
Right.
And one of the things is we will go on and talk about this is that there are actually other benefits besides taking care of the planet. There have been good studies done that say if globally we went to a plant-based diet for the planet, one of the things that would happen is mortality rates would decline by about 10%, because it turns out these meat-based diets are not what is best for things like our heart. And, it's kind of nice to have a heart that works.
It helps.
Yeah.
But
So,
how about overpopulation that way?
well, kill them off. Let's get some more diseases. Shit.
Oh, we can,
It turns out I don't have the story yet. It's in next week's story. Last year, the world's population growth was at 1%. It's at historical lows. You need a 2% population growth to stay even because a lot of people die and don't have children and stuff. And so they figure a 2% population growth is replacement level. And last year, the growth on the planet was below replacement level.
but the
That's a
base is
big
larger.
deal. That's a enormous deal. Our economic system is based on the idea of selling more. To selling more, it's good to have more customers. What do you do in a sell more economy when you have fewer people?
Yeah.
So it turns out that's a big story, but that's for next week.
Okay.
Now, the next story is my space and physics story. And Lawrence Livermore announced a few days ago that a year ago, they just passed the biggest milestone ever. On August 8th, 2021, they reached ignition. And ignition is, fusion happens when hydrogen atoms collide with enough force that they fuse together to make helium. And once they make a plasma, and once that hydrogen plasma ignites, the fusion reaction becomes self-sustaining. And when that happens, you can generate electricity. And if we could harness this reaction to generate electricity, it would be about the most efficient, least polluting energy sources possible. And the only fuel is hydrogen, and we have a lot of it in the ocean. And the only byproduct is helium, which not only is it not a dangerous long-term radioactive material, we don't have enough helium. So making more helium would be good. And now it wasn't very long. It was only for a few nanoseconds, so it wasn't very long. But for the few nanoseconds, just to give you a scale, they produce 1.3 megajoules of energy. And 1 megajoule is the kinetic energy of a 1-ton mass moving at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So I would say, to me, that sounds like a lot of energy, and I wouldn't want to be sitting on it.
How do they control it?
Oh, it's controlled right now in a magnetic bottle because physical bottles melt when you get at that temperature. And that's part of the problem. To be able to do it, one of the enabling technologies has been the superconducting super magnets, because you need a good magnet to confine something in it that's hotter than the sun.
Well, it's beyond me.
So it's a problem. And, this achieving the conditions needed for ignition has been a long-standing goal. And doing this means they can change what they're looking at the problem. Now, what they can look at is this new area where alpha particle heating becomes the predominant thing that's going on in the plasma. And they don't know much about that because we've never done it before. So, and as I say, the research comes after thousands of man hours around the world done over a period of decades. And this paper has over 1,000 authors included in it. And to me, I just can't imagine a paper with 1,000 authors, but it shows how broadly the credit goes for this work and how much science of this generation is something that is done by researchers sharing information and problems across the world.
So is the ultimate goal of this to replace nuclear power plants?
Of course, nuclear power plants are junk.
Right.
Also, one of the ultimate goals right now, it depends on when it gets going, what you can do with it, what you need to do with it. It looks like to some researchers that we're making enough headway with renewable powers so that by the time you get 10 or 15 years out, most of the opportunity to save the world by producing efficient power will be already taken care of by renewables. We still have this immense problem of all the CO2 we got to get out of the atmosphere. And it turns out what you really need to do that is cheap sources of energy. So I suspect that these fusion reactors, one real contribution we will see from them is in the 2040s, they will start to pull the CO2 out of the air. And people don't realize this. What we're going to start to see in the 2030s around the world is cities with cleaner air than anybody has known in their lifetime. And another thing we're going to see that people don't talk about much is a lower rate of people hospitalized with these various lung problems and heart problems that come from that pollution. You know, we already know in Beijing, where they had the Olympics a few years ago, they cut all the automobile traffic down. The pollution went down for a few weeks, and hospital admissions went down significantly during that time. So that's one of the things we have coming that nobody talks about. And when they're running the numbers about cost versus benefits, often you don't see any of the public health numbers included. And you know, what's it worth to save 10 or 20% on the public health budget in the planet?
Right. Well, let's hope they continue and we hear more
Right.
great
Well,
success stories.
they're doing it. This, I think what this means to me is that, you know, in 2025, there's the system that they're aiming at is their prototype is supposed to go up in 2025. That's 3 years. And if they're able to have a prototype up in 3 years, we know how to do the rest of it, and then you turn it into production, and that's going to happen in the 2030s, I believe. And I believe that this report is the thing that says for sure it's going to happen. We know how to do it. It's a matter of tweaking it, learning more about it, scaling it up, continuing to make the progress we're doing. If you look at superconducting at higher temperatures, the stuff that goes into the magnets that make these things work, that's another area where there is amazing progress. So the tools that it takes to make this happen are getting a lot better.
Yeah, I wonder why it took them a year to publish it.
I guess it takes them a while to figure this crap out. You'd think they
so.
just have a watt meter on it or something.
Right.
Maybe they don't have watt meters that can read that kind of instantaneous megajoule power outputs.
Right. ignition meters now.
Okay. Anyway, I wonder the same thing, because again, it was released a year after the date.
Right.
Science, I've heard, sometimes takes a while.
Yeah.
Well,
Plus
everything needs,
1,000 names on the
well,
document.
everything needs to be verified, and nobody wants to stick their neck out with some speculation.
Well, certainly on this kind of stuff, if you're making an announcement that changes the world, you'd like to know that you got it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I think here, to me, I'm so impressed with the work that they did to spread the credit around. What a wonderful job to put 1,000 names on the paper. And it's more than those 1,000 guys is the thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, makes me cry. I'm a softie though. Anyway, the next story is about how we can use what we already have to make what we need without polluting. It turns out, as I said in the introduction, cement is the most manufactured, most used material on the planet. And making cement, because you make it by subjecting limestone to high material and releasing, I guess, the gypsum out of it. And it generates about 7% of the annual greenhouse gases. And that whole thing can go away. At University of North Carolina, Wilmington has developed a method where you can use algae to grow limestone instead of mining it. And this cultivated limestone can be used directly in cement without any of that 7% of the energy used to put it in the right condition. And this is a quote from them: "We believe we have the best solution for cement and concrete industry to address its carbon problem," which is a fairly straightforward statement. And you reduce emissions by avoiding extracting and burning the limestone, but you also get another boost because when you're growing the limestone, it grows from eating more CO2. So not only do you avoid emissions, but you reduce the CO2 during the same time. And it's theoretically possible for this transition to happen overnight. You have to get your biogenic limestone reactors going. And once those are going to produce enough limestone, you just shut down the limestone mining industry that's used for cement, and start using your new material in your existing equipment, in your existing factories, in your existing processes. We have the tools and technology for this today. And by the way, the algae can do it, can live in hot water or cold water. They can live in fresh water or salt water. So there are no environmental barriers to the use of this. And besides all of this, you can use the microalgae at the same time to extract proteins and sugars and carbohydrates, which are high value products, which you can sell to reduce the cost of your limestone. So I think that is a multiple successful thing, using not technology, but using algae, which are the most efficient organism on the planet for turning sunlight into stuff.
So what type of algae, how do they grow this specific type of algae? They must have some nutrients or something.
You put it in a tank and you put sunlight on it,
and it grows.
And it grows.
and it turns into stone.
It makes limestone is what it produces.
That's amazing. The only algae I deal with is in my bird bath. I put bleach in it.
Right. Well, we know about some of these forms of algae, and because of them, algae doesn't have a good reputation. You think of it as green and slimy.
Right, right.
But it turns out there are thousands of algae. And there's a lot of promise in that green slime.
Yeah.
Now, the next thing is plastic pollution in waterways is a big problem, but it looks like it can be solved with a little thing, with bacteria. Researchers at University of Cambridge have found that there are naturally occurring bacteria that can break down plastic in lakes, but you need to have a particular mix of the bacterial species for this decomposition to begin to work. And it turns out if you have the right bacteria in the lake, the bacteria prefer to eat the plastic, and they'll eat the plastic first. And when they're done, they'll continue doing the bacteria work. It's harder for them to break down organic material and eat that, but they'll eat that once they're through eating the plastic. So I don't know if we have figured out how to put them in the ocean yet, but if we can clean up the lakes, that would be nice as a start.
Yeah. Love to see it.
You know, and it seems like one of the things about a lake is still a confined environment. When you talk about things like this, one of the criticisms or fears you hear is, what if it gets loose? Is it going to eat the planet?
Right.
And,
yeah,
you know, if it takes a particular environment for it to grow in, it'll only eat that environment.
it's like, don't we have like cables running underneath lakes, like the Great Lakes with telecommunications? Will it eat the cables up?
Right. I bet you could coat them where they're safe.
Right.
Bacteria-proof cables. Anyway, it just shows you there are solutions in areas that we're still not thinking about much. And for a couple of years, I've been convinced that one research areas that are going to really pay off are in bacteria and algae, because again, at base levels, these things produce a lot of different materials. We don't know what can be made by bacteria. For example, there are cyanobacteria growing in hot springs that have entirely different chemistries than all the other bacteria. And what that means is they make different things. And if only we knew what was here, we could figure out what to do with it.
Well, give it time.
Sounds like a job for science. I've heard some of the guys who are interested in this saying, you're spending billions of dollars to make rockets to get where? And you still haven't explored that salt pond down over there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think a relevant criticism. Anyway. Now, the next environmental story, I had a lot of them today because I thought these were all significant, was a new green revolution is coming. The last one was based on crop breeding successes, making high yielding dwarf wheat varieties that ended up increasing global cereal production by 400%, while the population grew by 260%. So during this period, we've grown food faster than we grow people. Ehrlich was talking about at this same time as this research was done, was talking about how we're going to have famines killing billions of people happening in the 60s and 70s. And I don't remember that headline. That's because of this green revolution. Anyway, this era's worth of green revolution is coming from biotech. Plant breeders in China have reported the development of supercharged rice and wheat, which they achieved by doing a genetic trick, doubling the expression of a regulatory gene that increases nitrogen uptake. And their rice varieties outproduce the others by 40 to 70%. Significant increases. And this produces this increase without all the use of the nitrogen fertilizer. And in the US at UC California Davis, their gene edited rice variety, they've done a trick to make their roots more hospitable to nitrogen fixing bacteria. Bacteria come back and do their job. Their plants produce about a third more crops, again, without all the nitrogen. And these are an example of the kind of genetic tricks that they're learning how to do now. And we're going to see that stuff spreading throughout the world of agriculture to be able to grow more food on less land using less expensive inputs is an agriculture problem they have all around the planet.
Would this fall into the GMO category?
I'm sure it would. This falls into whatever is next after GMO.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Because GMO right now is like the seed,
right,
and not what you feed it.
right. And
Yeah.
so this is changing genetic, the genome and how which determines the mechanism of how the plants work. So in one case, we have it 4 times more effective at using nitrogen, which means it grows more. And then in another case, we have it, I guess about 50% more effective from using nitrogen from its roots, getting help from the friends, the bacteria. And
Right.
this makes it grow more.
Good.
It's amazing stuff.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why there are, one of the issues in the world now is there are a lot of people who are becoming doomers. They're saying it's hopeless. And I'm not aligned with the doomers. And the reason I'm not aligned with the doomers is we are in this period of geometric changes or of exponential changes instead of the geometric changes that we know about. And people are just unable to forecast those. If you look at what's happened since with semiconductors and the increase in power as they have doubled every 2 years for the last 60 years, if you look at how fast cell phones replaced desktop phones, if you look at how fast renewable power is going in, these are rates of change that mostly we haven't seen before. The accumulation of all of these rates of change is going to bring us, I think, to a world that is hard to imagine and doesn't fit the doomsayers' view. So I'm sorry, maybe it'll be nice out,
As I
Okay,
say, time will tell.
Yeah, we'll find out, or our children will find out. And if we have any grandchildren, they might find out. Okay, now moving over to humanity, uh, this professor has a plan. His name is William McCaskill, and he's 35. And he says, if you're thinking about harming someone, it really doesn't matter that that person will be harmed next week or next year or even in 100 or 1,000 years. Harm is harm. Hard to argue with that. You can quibble about time scales, but because of this, he's developed an argument that is called long-termism, which is a word he coined to describe the idea that humans have a moral responsibility to protect the future of humanity, prevent it from going extinct, and create a better future for many generations to come. And he says, right today, people need to figure out how to minimize the harm that global threats like pandemics and biowarfare and climate change or nuclear disaster could have not on us today, but on future humans. And he encourages people to think outside the box of what a future could look like. For example, maybe humans can live on other planets. We know they're working on that. That'll take care of the extinction of the planet, but otherwise, the sun in 500,000,000 years. So, our clock is running and we only have 500,000,000 years until the sun gets too hot to support life on this planet. And he's saying maybe if we thought about that and started to figure it out, we could do something to keep the sun from getting hotter 500,000,000 years from now, and it would be nice. It's a real pain in that, what a nuisance it is to move. And just imagine if you had to move everybody to another planet. So anyway, I appreciate this is a guy who's thinking bigger than most people I have ever read. And I love it, actually. I can see you're thinking there, Daryl. I can see.
Well, I'm trying to think trillions of years from now, and
It's inconceivable.
yeah, I'm looking at my calendar just for next week, and
Well, when I was a kid, as I told you, I've read sci-fi for a long time, and one of the things that I would think about is, what's the perspective if you're looking at me from some planet in some other solar system, and how big are my problems then?
correct.
But this guy is thinking a lot bigger than I was. Anyway, on some of these things, I'll say we'll see. On this one, we have to imagine
Right.
what we have. Now, one more little human story, and it's about the impact of cell phones. The brain scientists have been concerned about the negative impact of cell phones, and they finally did some studying. And this study says that cell phones actually can boost people's memory skills. And what they did was they designed a little phone system to test external memory, but the phone system helps people to select to remember something. They developed a memory task to be done on a touch screen that had a bunch of circles on them. And depending on what size the circles are, you're supposed to remember to drag them right or drag them left. And if you drag them one way, you get more points than you get when you drag them the other way. And what they set up the phone so the phone could remember which way to drag half of them. So you had a reminder. And so it turns out people generally used them as reminders to do the high scoring circles and get those right. And it turns out using it in that way, the scores for their upper circles was improved by 18%. So that's quite a victory. But it turns out because they're not using their brain's memory for the high scores circle, it looks like they're better to remember the low scoring circles. So their score for the low scorers improved by 27%, even when they weren't using it. So they got a better improvement about what they weren't using the computer memory for. And these results were unexpected, but it says things are not the same as we thought. And again, I think it is kind of related to Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals, how we have a more vigorous intellectual culture, but smaller brain size. And I think we have offloaded some of our brain tasks into our culture.
Probably so. I agree with that.
Yeah, anyway, so it's interesting. This is not what I read presently in anthropology, but I think I will be reading it later. Okay, now to take care of ourselves, which leisure activities are linked to a lower risk of dementia? And it turns out leisure activities like reading a big book, doing yoga, or spending time with family and friends help. And if you look at those things all together, careful research has found that leisure activity like crafts and sports and volunteering were linked to a reduced risk of dementia. And those who engaged in these kind of leisure activities had a 17% lower risk of dementia. So that reduced it by about a sixth, which is fairly significant. It turns out if you look at the details though, doing leisure activities that are mental activities that make you use the brain have a 23% lower risk of dementia, which is pretty significantly lower than these leisure activities. Exercise gives you a 17% lower chance of dementia, and social activities give yourself a 7% lower risk of dementia. So as I read these analysis of the meta-analysis, what it says to me is the thing that does me the most good is doing stuff like we're doing today, stuff that actually uses my brain. And sometimes after reading the articles to study for the talk, I have to go nap because I had to think too hard.
Yep, I agree with the study.
Anyway, so I would think you do. I think given the photo behind you, you live part of your life based on that.
Yeah, I do a lot of reading and technical paper research and technical research on telescope setups and
Right.
photography. So yeah, it keeps my brain busy.
Right. And the way, since you're using technology, then you can guarantee what you know to do and how to do it is going to be different next year or the year after that than it is now. So it's going to be a whole bunch more crap that you got to figure out.
Oh, yeah, I started to do the astrophotography back in the 1980s. And we were using film. We were using film
Yes,
back then. And I was developing my own film. So I learned that side of the
right.
trade. And then, and then CCDs came out. And then cooled CCDs, and then CMOS and cooled CMOS, and
Uh-huh.
everything's changed.
Yes,
Everything's changed.
yes. So it keeps you working, and I think that keeps us alive.
I agree.
And I know John is an active, curious guy because he keeps showing up at these things and having comments, and he's thinking about them too.
Yep.
And it sounds like with your kids and stuff, John, you've been thinking about them since your kids were young.
Well, that's true. And I've been lucky. I have three boys, and they all are very successful in whatever it is that they picked to do. And I did not push them one way or the other.
Uh-huh. But
But
they've carried you along a little bit too, I bet.
well, my middle son, he's grown to a point where he doesn't even talk to me anymore.
Well, that's how it goes.
Yeah, I suppose.
You
But
know, what I've
I also,
noticed with families is the more in the families, the higher odds of something like you're talking about being the case, that somebody's going to hate somebody. And the more of them there are, the more of them that'll hate each other.
yeah, I'm
Oh,
not
well.
sure what it is that I did that to deserve this kind of treatment.
Uh-huh.
But and anyway, I'm still proud of him because when he sold his company, he merged with another company. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and we're talking multi-million dollars.
Uh-huh. As we're talking before the show, that's right. He did a lot better than I did. I had 20 different jobs, and when I retired,
Well,
I had my Social Security check.
yeah, yeah. My middle son did the best financially of all of us,
Uh-huh.
and
That's the one that won't talk to you?
yeah, and he is also the one that has two sons himself, and they
Uh-huh.
don't talk to me. Again,
Uh-huh.
one of the reasons, of course, is that they've always lived far away. I mean, like at least
Sure.
a 5 hour drive, and so grandpa and grandma were never that interesting to them, and so and and I when they were growing up, we were really struggling because I got a little cocky and I dropped a good good job I had,
Right.
and thinking I pick up another job and the one that I would want never
Well,
materialized.
again, I spent my life in Silicon Valley, which means that the odds of doing something good and then having the company die and being laid off or all those things may happen. I had two of the big changes with the company I worked for that moved me from being director of marketing and sales in a semiconductor company to being on the street. I had one time where I started companies with other guys. We got some custom clients. We were ramping up into production, spending all our money on components, and both companies that were our customers went belly up at the same time.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Marketing is not all that easy, actually.
no, nothing is easy in my experience. Anyway, so the last story is an exercise question, and research shows it's not how, it is how often you exercise, not how much. And to test it carefully, they did a couple of routines. They were using bicep contractors. They were being measured on some machine, and they had one group performing 30 contractions a week at one time, and another group was doing 6 contractions a day, 5 days of the week, and then not doing anything 2 days of the week. Both guys gained muscle mass, but the one doing the fewer exercises more often gained 10% strength in their muscles. The others didn't gain any strength in their muscles. So this goes to show that for at least for strength exercises, doing a little bit more often is more beneficial than doing a lot occasionally. So I was saying in the beginning, this means you don't have to get ready and go to the gym for your weekly workout. Just do a little bit at home most days. You don't have to do it every day. One of the advantages of the 5 days a week schedule instead of 7 days is you have to rest some to actually do the cellular work to rebuild the muscle. So if you're doing it every day, you don't get as good effects as you get doing it 5 out of 7.
I buy that, yeah.
So
I do exercise every day though.
good. You're doing it right. Take a couple of days off.
Right?
Well,
I-
sometimes like when I wound up in the hospital.
Okay, well, don't do it that way.
No,
No,
Don't-
but typically, I do some calisthenics. And then I walk on my treadmill for 20 minutes.
Sure, that's good. That's good. Anyway, good to see you guys and good
Thanks
to
for all the
talk.
work.
And we'll
I'm
see you
sorry you
next week.
don't have,
Well, we
Yeah.
have, we
sorry you don't
have,
have a great audience.
we
thanks,
have the,
Richard.
we have the best audience I can imagine. So thank you.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
Anyway, thanks, Richard. Say hello to Carol.
Adios.
Yes.